Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
And good evening, friends. Welcome to this Tuesday night, November 10, 2015 edition of Nightcast. First of all, I want to apologize for being about 15 minutes late tonight. Beside hosting this program, I have responsibilities in a church that is scattered that I had to give some attention to today, and it just threw me behind a little bit. But we have an interesting night of news in spite of that, and a lot of it. So let's begin. First story tonight comes out of Europe and the EU. Prime Minister David Cameron has published a letter outlining his four main issues for reforming the UK's membership of the EU. The list of goals, as you'll see and hear him in this video. Now, it's not the best audio because the BBC did the best job they could of getting this. They had a camera there, and there was no microphone plug-in offering, so they just had to take they just had to mic it off the speaker in the room. But you can hear him. You'll just have to listen closely, and it's worth listening to. You'll hear David Cameron go through his list of goals: the single market, sovereignty, competitiveness, and immigration, which was branded as a gimmick by some conservative colleagues. The European Commission claimed some parts were, quote, highly pragmatic. So, how have EU member states reacted to the demands? Europe editor Katja Adler has our opening report with this in video tonight.
Let the show begin. David Cameron's letter, his wish list for reform, has now arrived here in Brussels, EU HQ. You'll have seen the flags of all the 28 EU member states behind me here at the European Parliament. The horse trading will now begin in earnest. But what have been the initial reactions? Well, all eyes automatically focus on EU powerhouse Germany. And Angela Merkel hinted again today she'll do what she can to get as many Cameron reforms passed as possible to help keep Britain in the EU.
Some points are more difficult than others, but given that we're working in the spirit of wanting to reach a solution, I'm reasonably confident that we can succeed. Germany will certainly do its bit to help as far as European rules permit.
Protecting the rights of non-Eurozone countries, giving national parliaments more of a say in the EU, and making the bloc more competitive. Well, there is broad agreement on that, but immigration is quite a different story. Controversially, David Cameron wants to curb EU migration. It's fine to crack down on benefit tourism, say other European leaders, but not to discriminate against other EU citizens working in the UK. Poland, in particular, is incensed.
Free movement in Europe is one of the achievements of the European Union, and we, of course, cannot agree to any measures which will discriminate the Polish citizens living in the United Kingdom.
It's not just what David Cameron is asking for, how he asks is also key. Does he demand, dictate, or negotiate? European leaders also want Britain to be more engaged in the EU. Take the current migrant crisis. Italy is one of many countries calling on the UK to show far more solidarity, they say.
I'm quite worried about the behavior of the United Kingdom Prime Minister, and I would like to see more cooperative towards the other states. I'm talking about migration flows were going to increase. I'm talking about financial crisis. What I'm asking to Cameron, why don't you come with us? Why don't you sit on a table? And why don't you help us to build a space of security, a space of rights, a space of movements that can be a model from all other parts of the world.
27 different countries to persuade, and all need to be on board if the Prime Minister is to get the reforms he wants.
All right, friends, now I mentioned a little too early about how you're going to have to listen carefully to David Cameron. He's in this next video with that audio that was picked up off the speakers, where today he was delivering a speech setting out the details of, you heard the men in the last part of the video talk about how they wanted England, David Cameron, to do a model that's more in line with what some of the other people want? Yeah, what they want, what you heard the man saying, essentially, was they want David Cameron, they want the UK to give the rest of Europe a lot of the blessings that God gave to one of the sons of Joseph, the son Ephraim, whose descendants today are the people of the modern day UK, who along with brother Manasseh, the other son of Joseph, received a double portion of God's blessings promised to Abraham and Abraham's descendants through Isaac and through Jacob and his son Joseph. Now, the other 12 sons of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, received blessings for the end time too, and all of them part of a offspring so numberless that God compared it to the number of the skies, the stars in the sky for number. If you can count them, you'll know how many offspring God promised Abraham through his son Isaac and Jacob, his sons Isaac and Jacob. And especially the blessings God gave through Jacob's son Joseph and his two sons Ephraim and Manasseh. Ephraim, again, being the descendants of the modern day people in the UK. The blessings of which the rest of Europe wants David Cameron to give away, those blessings of God to the sons, the descendants of Ephraim, people in the UK. They want them to give them to the rest of Europe. If people only understood who they were and why these blessings are where they are and the boundaries that God himself set for peoples that God does not want crossed, except that God does tell his people, the descendants of Jacob, to whom the promises of race and grace were given, through grace is through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Jacob's descendant Judah. We have to become spiritual Jews. Grace comes through that race, that lineage. And if people only understood, who we are, but they don't. And in this speech you're going to hear, now again, you'll have to listen carefully because they mic'd it off the speaker system in the room instead of having a direct mic on him. But you can hear him as he delivers this speech, setting out the details of what he wants, David Cameron wants to achieve in his attempts to renegotiate the terms of the UK's membership of the EU. One demand you'll hear here is for a guarantee that countries who do not use the euro are not discriminated against within the EU. And he'll make mention that there's two different types of members of the EU, those who are in the Eurozone and those who are not. At the end of it, I'll try to clarify that a little bit for you if you are kind of fuzzy. Well, what's the difference? If you're in the EU, aren't you in the EU? No, the UK is in the EU, but they are not a member of the Eurozone because the UK has not converted its currency, the British pound sterling, over to the euro. The UK continues to circulate and use as its national currency its British pound sterling, where the other countries who are members of the Eurozone have surrendered their national currencies and circulate the euro instead, which is part of the reason why Greece got into such financial trouble by having submitted to that. And of course, not that alone, because other countries that submitted to that did okay. Greece had particular problems, but there are, besides the UK, there are a few countries who are members of the EU who have not surrendered their national currencies and who therefore are not considered part of the Eurozone. I hope that helps you. I went ahead and explained it before you hear him speak. And as he mentions that factor of the two divisions, maybe that'll help you it'd be clear in your mind what he's saying when he says that here, as you have to kind of listen carefully to hear him speaking through the speaker into the mic that the BBC camera picks up. David Cameron says these protections that he's asking for will create a British model of EU membership that other non-Euro countries, non-Eurozone countries, could also adopt. Here is David Cameron.
First, it's in all our interests for the Eurozone to have the right governance and structures to secure a successful currency for the long term. Britain understands that, and we won't stand in the way of those developments as long as we can be sure that there are mechanisms in place to ensure that our own interests are fully protected. Let me explain what I mean. There are today two sorts of members of the European Union. There are Euro members and non-Euro members. The changes which the Eurozone will need to implement will have profound implications for both types of member. So non-Euro members, like Britain, which are outside the Eurozone, need certain safeguards in order to protect the single market and our ability to decide its rules, and to ensure that we face neither discrimination nor additional costs from the integration of the Eurozone. Because the European Union and the Eurozone are not the same thing. And those of us who are in the EU but outside the Eurozone need that accepted. We need a British model of membership that works for Britain and for any other non-Euro members.
Okay, friends, now let me bring things back to normal. I really pushed the equalization of the audio as he was speaking to help make it as clear to hear as possible. So I hope that helped you. As you heard him emphasize there at the end, there are two types of membership. There's membership in the EU, and there are those within that membership who are part of the Eurozone and those who are not. And again, just summarizing, we'll highlight in a few quick words, those who are part of the Eurozone have surrendered their national currencies over and circulate only the euro within their country rather than their own national currency, which they got rid of to use the euro. The countries that did that are part of the Eurozone. Those countries, including the UK, who did not do that, are not part of the Eurozone, although they are members of the EU. I hope that's clear for you. And that's what he's saying. And he's saying, as you just heard him, he's saying that they need a British model, which also applies to the other countries who are members of the EU, who are not part of the Eurozone, who have not surrendered their national currencies over to the EU and circulate the euro only as their money. So he's saying they need a special model to protect that, because UK is not willing to give up the British pound sterling yet. And they may never, and that may wind up causing them eventually to be booted out of the EU once the EU's gotten whatever else they can get out of the UK out of them. We don't know. We have to watch that and see how it's going to come down. But the EU is ultimately, they're going to be whittled down to 5 countries from the east and 5 countries, either countries or regions, however they may get rebordered in this whole process. That'll be like the 10 toes, 5 from one foot, 5 from another foot. Let's come out just for a moment while I'm explaining this to a wider shot in the studio. All right, what's happening to our camera buttons here? Oh, okay, I see. Oh, we got 3 on both banks here. All right, let's go out to another bank where I can switch cameras. All right, let's go out to a wider shot, or so I can zoom out, I should say. And you see above me, we've got let's come out a little more. We've got the statue from Daniel 2 that King Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream that Daniel interpreted for the king. And let me find a camera button that will let us zoom in on one or the other. Let's go up to the top. This is the image of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar saw in his dream. And as you look down, you see the head of gold that Daniel told the king, King Nebuchadnezzar, you are this head of gold on this statue that you saw in your dream. And they explained the rest of it. He explained the arms of silver and the belly and thighs of brass and the legs of iron and the feet made of partly of iron and miry clay, 2 substances that do not mix. Which illustrates the point God is making that they don't get along, because miry clay, common clay and iron, they won't mix. You can compound them together, but they don't really adhere and stick. They don't stick together. And that's the point God's making about the 5 from the east on one foot. They won't get along with one another even within the east. Similarly, likewise, the 5 from the west, miry clay, common clay, and iron, they won't get along with one another. And certainly the east and the west won't really get along with one another, but some event will come along that will cause all 10 of them, both the east and the west, the 5 from the east and the 5 from the west, however they're rebordered and re-regionalized or whatever, there'll be 5 leaders from the east and 5 leaders from the west, ultimately, when it comes down to the political union that gives its power to what the Bible calls a beast, which will be simply this. All right, let me come back with you, because you've seen the statue, you got the idea. Let's come on down. When they give those 10, give their power to that beast, that'll be the restoration of the Holy Roman Empire for its seventh restoration and its final restoration with a seventh head, a seventh and final head. Well, let's go over here. Let's go over to these pictures here on this wall, and we'll zoom in real quickly on one in the center where you see this crown of the Holy Roman Empire. And this crown will be, it's being guarded right now in the Royal Treasury in Vienna, Austria. I've been there and seen this crown with my own eyeballs. It's in a glass cage in a room, well guarded. You can't, there are guards, even if they may not be in the room at the moment, there are guards to the entrance and exits of that building who very carefully watching. You try to walk out of there with a crown as big and gawky as this thing is, or some package big enough to hold that, you won't get very far, because they got their eyes on this, and it's in a glass cage which has alarms on it. You try to break that cage, you're setting off a huge alarm. Anyway, this crown is going to be worn one last time for what I was mentioning earlier to you. Maybe you can envision it better by seeing this slide on the screen. This crown will be worn one last time for a seventh and final revision of the Holy Roman Empire. There will be a seventh head who will be the restorer. He'll be an emperor, a dictator even, but an emperor, the seventh restoration emperor who will be crowned by the Pope. The Pope always does this. For example, let's come out just a moment and let's just run through real quickly. I got a lot of stories tonight, but let's just real quickly run through the first restorer of the empire. That was Justinian. Then there was Charlemagne, and in this portrait you see right there the portrait showing the Pope crowning Charlemagne, the second restoration of the Holy Roman Empire. Revelation 17:10 says there are 7 kings. It's talking about 7 kings who each restored or revived the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne was the second, and you see here the Pope performing the coronation ceremony in which he crowns Charlemagne. Then following that, a Pope crowns the third restorer and revision of the Holy Roman Empire, which was Otto the Great in the case of the third king. And then down over here to the fourth of those kings who restored the Holy Roman Empire, it was Charles V. And then over next to him, let's see, after Charles V, he was the fourth. And then the fifth was Napoleon. And from Justinian to Napoleon, there was a continuous reign of the Holy Roman Empire that spanned 1,260 years, which is a prophetic number that multiplies, that we explain on our programs on the weekend, on the Sabbaths, on the Sabbath.tv channel for those who are interested in that detail. But following Napoleon, and in the year prior to the Battle of Waterloo, he lost a battle that put him out of office, which ended the 1,260-year continuous reign of the Holy Roman Empire, even though it had new kings throughout 5 of them. Revelation 17 says there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen. I just showed you the 5 who are fallen, starting with, again, up here, Justinian, then Charlemagne, then Otto the Great, then Charles IV, then Napoleon, ending those 5 who are fallen. Then there was a period of just over 100 years, from 1814, when Napoleon lost that battle, the year before the Battle of Waterloo. He lost that battle that ended the 1,260-year reign from Justinian in 554 A.D. to Napoleon's end 1,260 years later in 1814 A.D. Then there was 100 years, a little more than 100 years, when the Holy Roman Empire went into the pit, went into the abyss. And it had to be revived, where Revelation 17 is saying there 5 are fallen and 1 is. Now, God had John write in the present future perfect tense, way before this happened, to be speaking of a period of time between 1936 and 1945, when Mussolini restored the Holy Roman Empire as the 6th king, the 6th restorer of the Holy Roman Empire. He claimed to be El Duce after he went in and conquered Ethiopia, and saying he had restored the Holy Roman Empire. God revealed that, caused Herbert W. Armstrong to see that, God's apostle for these end days, the Apostle Herbert, as I often call him. Many of the apostles were simply called by their first name, the Apostle Paul. Well, we have, for the latter days, we have the Apostle Herbert. God caused the Apostle Herbert to see, so that God would be showing us who is and was his servant for these end days. And that was the Apostle Herbert, through whom he revealed who this 6th king, the sixth restorer of the Holy Roman Empire, the one who is, and only is, between 1936 and 1945, when Mr. Armstrong was broadcasting coast to coast in North America on very, very and announced Mussolini Il Duce, restorer of the Holy Roman Empire. Now, his reign from 1936 to 1945, you may say, hey, that was only a 9.5 years, almost 10-year reign. Well, that's all that Napoleon and some of the others had. Napoleon reigned from 1804 to 1814, and from the fall of 1804 to the spring of 1814, that was just a period of 9.5 years. Mussolini had the same length of reign as the fifth king that the Bible mentions. There are 7 kings, 5 are fallen. The fifth of those kings reigned only 9.5 years. And the face you see on the screen now, the sixth of those kings, Mussolini, also reigned for only 9.5 years until April 28, 1945, when he was shot and then hung upside down with his comrades and mistress from a canopy of an Esso gasoline station in Italy, as you see here. There he is, shot in the belly and hanging upside down. His mistress on the right side of the screen from you with her skirt tied with a rope around her knees for modesty reasons, and then on the other side and behind him, his comrades also strung up there, hung upside down from that canopy with him. Again, ending that reign on April 28, 1945. That ended that sixth revision of the Holy Roman Empire. It went back into the abyss that year, 1945, unto the present. Here we are in 2015 now, and friends, Revelation 17, verse 10 says, there are 7 kings, 5 are fallen, 1 is, and 1 is yet to come. That 1 is no more. So you could say, all right, we're in a period where 6 are now fallen, because that 1 was written only for 1936 to 1945. So 6 are fallen, but the latter part of that verse 10 of Revelation 17 that says, and 1 is yet to come, is still a future prophecy. And we don't know who that king is just yet. But when the time comes, God will show us who that is, and that king will wear this crown that, again, we'll pull it up on the screen just real quick. He will wear this crown you see pictured here right in the center of this slide. This big, gawky, jeweled crown will be worn next and final king of the Holy Roman Empire, who will introduce the great tribulation that Christ speaks of in Matthew 24, verses 20, 21, 22. A period of trouble that Christ called the Great Tribulation, saying that it's a time of trouble so bad that no time since the beginning of the world to this time, no nor ever after, is going to be the time of what he called the Great Tribulation. Nothing worse since the beginning of the world, nothing ever going to be as bad again afterward, thankfully. It's also the time Jeremiah referred to as the time of Jacob's trouble. It's also called the same thing, a time of trouble so great that no other time of trouble will be like what's coming in this great tribulation, the time of Jacob's trouble. Jacob had 12 sons. One of those sons was Joseph. He had 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And friends, Ephraim and Manasseh, being part of Jacob, and time of their trouble, and this trouble caused in large part by this European Union that's going to form as a United States of Europe, with 5 leaders from the east, 5 leaders from the west, none of them getting along with one another that well, but some event coming along that will cause them to come together and give their power to one leader, one dictator, one new emperor, who the Pope will crown as the head of this restored Holy Roman Empire for its 7th and last time. And there's more to that, which we're going to explain on the weekend. But let's get on with the story. You just heard UK Prime Minister David Cameron explaining the British model they desire, which that's going to make Europe and the EU leaders really, really happy about what the British want in their model. You heard in the opening story, you heard the Chancellor of Germany, who pretty much heads the EU situation thing now. People look to Germany and look to its leader, and especially Chancellor Angela Merkel, and she's saying she's going to back David Cameron as much as she can. But then you heard other people speaking that are saying, hey, they're not real happy about what David Cameron wants in his model. They wish he would behave himself and just go along and submit to the rest of them and let them all take the blessings God gave to the descendants of Ephraim in today's modern-day UK and give it to the rest of Europe, which has been overrun with migrants and refugees and migrants, people coming in from borders, leaving the borders in which God put them. And, of course, the God of this world has created a situation where it does make people want to leave their countries, where there's fire on both sides of them with wars going on, and they're caught in the middle. And then some of those people from a culture where they would love to get inside of Europe and try to bring their culture, a non-Christian Muslim culture, in and get rid of the infidels, and that's going to bring holy hell upon the earth. World War III on the way, and that's one of the elements of the Great Tribulation. During the Great Tribulation, there's several events that are going to occur. Round 3 of World War will commence with the beginning of the Great Tribulation. It's also going to be a time of the greatest martyrdom of God's saints ever to occur. It'll be the time when God's 2 witnesses are giving their testimony, and it'll be the time that those who receive the promise Christ made at the end of verse 21, let's see, what are we, Luke 21, verse 36, that Christ gave at the end of verse 36 of Luke 21, where he said, he instructed to watch and pray about the world events that relate to, let's go real quickly over here to this chart, that relate to the first 4 seals of 7 seals from Revelation, the first 4 being the only ones that are active right now. The next seal, the next major event in prophecy to be that 5th seal, which is, as Christ explained, the Great Tribulation. And in verse 36 of Luke 21, where Christ says, watch these active seals as they intensify in frequency and intensity. Watch them. And when you see them increase their frequency and increase in intensity, he then said, know that just as you know when summer is nigh by seeing the branches of a tree become tender and their little buds spring forth, he said, likewise, when you see these things increase in frequency and in intensity, he said, then you'll know the kingdom of God is near. And before the kingdom of God can come, the next major event in prophecy has to occur, which is a 2.5-year period of great tribulation, followed by a sealing of the 144,000, which is then followed by the day of the Lord, which is a 1-year-long period. And in between all that, between the sealing of the 144,000 and the Great Tribulation, there's the 6th seal, the heavenly signs, the astro signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. Now, again, we covered details of this much more deeply on the weekend on the Sabbath.TV channel, but for now, let me bring us on back and get to our next story. Now, we saw the story here with David Cameron speaking. Let's go over now to what's happening in Egypt after the Russian plane crash. I told you earlier this week, since Sunday night, I was telling you I'd get the video, related to Russia bringing back 11,000 of its tourists from Egypt. We've seen how Britain is trying to bring back its tourists who got stuck there after they stopped the aircraft from flying back until they could get a British team in there to check the aircraft. Russia's done something very similarly. And the caption with this story I have for you, including video in a moment, the caption with this opening photograph to this story reads, this woman arrived at a Moscow airport from the Egyptian resort of Hurghada on Saturday. And then the story goes like this. Russia says it has flown 11,000 tourists home from Egypt in the past 24 hours, and more will return on Sunday. Now, we're talking about 2 days ago on Sunday, and this story is dated Sunday, and I just wasn't able to get the video Sunday. I told you a couple nights in a row I'd have it by tonight, and I have it here for you. Moscow announced on Friday, last Friday, before the weekend, that it was suspending all flights to Egypt after that Russian plane crashed in Sinai, having initially urged caution towards claims a bomb might have downed the jet. Dozens of special flights were put on for tourists wanting to go home. And then a remembrance service has been held in St. Petersburg on Sunday for the crash's 224 victims, most of whom were Russian. You'll hear in this next video the main bell of the northern city's St. Isaac's Cathedral tolling 224 times, once for each of the victims. We'll get to that video in a moment. Meanwhile, the victims, Meanwhile, another Russian plane with the victims' remains, the fourth since the crash on October 31st, landed at St. Petersburg's airport as the identification process continued. The UK has flown 3,500 travelers out of Sharm el-Sheikh, from where Metrojet Flight 9268 took off for St. Petersburg on October 31st. The UK halted flights to and from the resort on Wednesday last week, citing intelligence concerns that the Airbus may have been downed by a bomb. Russia criticized the UK decision, but then on Friday announced it was going to do the same thing and stop all flights to Egypt. Russian President Vladimir Putin signed the temporary flight ban into law 2 days ago on Sunday. Russians make up close to 1 in 3 of all foreign tourists in Egypt, most of them holidaymakers visiting resorts such as Sharm el-Sheikh and Hurghada. In 2014, about 3 million Russian nationals stayed at Egypt's resorts. Russians make up close to 1 in 3 of all foreign tourists in Egypt, most of them holidaymakers visiting, again, resorts such as Sharm el-Sheikh and Hurghada. All right, I think I repeated that. Here's the video now where Russians, the lead-in for this video is Russians criticized the UK decision, but then on Friday announced it was stopping all flights to Egypt as well.
In St. Petersburg today, they stopped and they listened. The bell rang out 224 times for each victim of the Russian plane crash.
And friends, just a reminder that this video is from Sunday. They were ringing these bells 2 days ago on Sunday. Here's the rest of the video.
Inside St. Isaac's, there were prayers for the dead. People here are struggling to come to terms with what happened, and they're frightened of what might happen next.
It's not only the scale of this disaster which has shocked people in St. Petersburg and across Russia, it's the growing suggestion that it may well have been a bomb that blew a plane with Russian holidaymakers out of the sky.
The Kremlin had claimed its airstrikes in Syria would make Russians safer at home by neutralizing the threat from international terrorism. So if it was a bomb that destroyed the Airbus, will Russians feel let down by their government? At St. Petersburg Airport, at the makeshift shrine to the victims of the air crash, the people we spoke to still supported Russia's operation in Syria. If you take on evil, there's always the chance it will hit you back, she says. Act like a coward, and it will hit you even more. Russians are not blaming their leaders for this disaster, but they are numb with grief. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, St. Petersburg.
Thank you, Steve Rosenberg. Friends, just to bring you up to date now, officials said there were about 80,000 Russian tourists in Egypt when Moscow took the decision to stop the flights last Wednesday. Holidaymakers were flown back without hold luggage, mirroring the restrictions placed on British tourists being repatriated. The British Foreign Secretary Philip Hammond said the delays to flights for Britons who were stranded in the Red Sea resort were caused by the much higher level of security checking being imposed. And then we have one more photograph with this story showing some of the wreckage of that Russian flight 9268. And let's see, I think we have one more photograph here. The caption with this photograph reads, "Russians make up a third of all foreign visitors to Egypt." And the rest of this story goes like this. "We are running up against the capacity limits of the airport given the additional measures that are being applied, and that's what's causing the delay to some flights." Foreign Secretary Hammond said to the BBC officials, "At most, people will experience a delay of 2 or 3 days." He added, an Egyptian member of, and remember this story runs from Sunday, so we're now at the second day, maybe one more day delay. An Egyptian member of the international team investigating the crash has told Reuters that they are 90% sure that a sound heard in the last moments of the recording of the plane's cockpit voice recorder was an explosion caused by a bomb. On Saturday, the head of the investigating team, Ayman al-Makadam, said it was too early to say what caused the plane to break up in midair. Militants in the Sinai Peninsula affiliated with the Islamic State have claimed they brought down the airliner, but they haven't said how. All right, that's the end of that story. We've got, friends, we're running a little longer tonight, and I've got a very important story that I've saved toward the end that I hope you'll listen up to, because this explains some things that relate to the coming United Europe and some of the things that the Apostle Herbert W. Armstrong, told us to watch for in what would bring together the EU. He told us that there were 3 essential elements that we should be watching for. First of all, an economic union, a single currency. That didn't happen while Mr. Armstrong was alive, but 14 years later, actually 13 years later, it began to happen, and then 14 years later, they began circulating the euro. In 1999, they did it in a bookkeeping fashion. 2000, 2001, they began to actually circulate the currency, the euro. And some countries began converting their national currency over to the euro, and those who did that, again, became part of the Eurozone, the early Eurozone, which then grew as other countries became part of the EU and converted their national currencies over to the EU, to the euro, becoming, again, part of the Eurozone. Now, this next story, oh, wait a minute. Let me cue up the right one. Yeah, here we go. This is the story that we want to focus on to end the program tonight. The former West German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt has died at age 96. He led the then West Germany from 1974 to 1982 as it rose to become a global economic powerhouse. He was receiving treatment at home after his health worsened dramatically this week. In this video story, and then we'll have more for you following this, some really interesting details. One news article reports that I've taken excerpts from, we'll quote for you after this video, with Jenny Hill looking back at the life of Helmut Schmidt.
Helmut Schmidt knew how to play, and he knew how to plan. His political strategy set the tone for modern Germany. As its Chancellor, he took on uncompromisingly economic recession and homegrown terrorism. A passenger plane was hijacked in 1977. He ordered his special forces to storm it. 2 years later, this was the response to his decision to allow American nuclear missiles onto German soil. But a skilled diplomat, he eased Cold War tensions, forged a lasting relationship with France, and paved the way for Europe as we know it today. And here he is, 40 years ago, a German chancellor trying to persuade Britain to stay in Europe.
I cannot totally avoid to put myself into the position of a man who, in front of ladies and gentlemen belonging to the Salvation Army, tries to convince them of the advantages of drinking.
Outside his Hamburg home tonight, tributes to a man described as one of Germany's father figures.
Helmut Schmidt war eine politische Institution.
Helmut Schmidt, says Angela Merkel, was a political institution, someone to whom I could turn, whose advice and judgment were valuable.
Mir etwas bedeuteten.
But perhaps Germans will best remember him in a cloud of his beloved cigarette smoke. Someone once described Helmut Schmidt as a visionary. His retort, people who have visions should see a doctor.
And friends, the New York Times dug out a quote, Helmut Schmidt, in which Mr. Schmidt said, "I had a Jewish grandfather." Perhaps that's where he got some of the wit that you heard. Now, isn't that interesting? Schmidt had a Jewish grandfather, Helmut Schmidt, the former West German Chancellor. Now, let me take a few moments as we close the program tonight, going just a little bit longer than we usually go. Let me give you some of the excerpts from today's New York Times story on Mr. Schmidt. And now I'm reading these excerpts from the New York Times, just some here and some there. And working with his close friend, President Volodymyr, let's see, is that where I want to begin this story? Not really. Let me back up a little bit. Give me one moment here. All right, Mr. Schmidt died on Tuesday, today, at the age of 96, and working with his close friend, President Giscard d'Estaing of France, he helped soften European distrust of his country for its Nazi past. Here are some of the achievements of Mr. Schultz. He helped his country to ease some of the European distrust of his country for its Nazi past, a past that to many of its survivors was still fresh in painful memory 30 years on. Mr. Schmidt made grievous policy errors which were compounded by his unwillingness to admit fallibility and his seeming disregard for diplomacy with allies and foes alike. They were failings that led the Bundestag, Germany's parliament, to dismiss him after 8 years in office. His distractors accused him of being overwilling to accommodate Moscow in his desire to salvage détente, the notion backed avidly by West Germany and France that stronger economic and political ties with the Russians would entice them into a smoother relationship with the West. Moreover, his intemperate criticism of Washington promoted neutralist, anti-American tendencies in his Social Democratic Party, which only helped undermine his chancellorship. Mr. Schmidt was confident, too confident, some said, about his ability to sustain prosperity in West Germany. Under his stewardship, his nation fared better than the rest of Europe during the 1970s economic crisis, which was provoked by a sharp rise in petroleum prices controlled by OPEC, the cartel of major oil exporting countries. But Schmidt was criticized in the early 1980s as having failed to prepare West Germany for a recession. Still, Mr. Schmidt remained popular, owing in no small part to the affection West Germans felt for his down-to-earth wife, Hannelore Schmidt. A biologist and amateur botanist, she eschewed ceremony in favor of promoting conservation and protecting endangered plants. Flowers in Latin America and Africa were named after her, and she wrote or co-wrote books on plants and ecology. She died in 2010 at age 91. Mr. Schmidt might have been able to survive politically if he had antagonized opponents less. But in the Bundestag, he was resented for his attacks on legislators who disagreed with him. In 1982, a parliamentary majority voted him out of office by passing a no-confidence motion and replaced him with Helmut Kohl, leader of the conservative Christian Democratic Party. It was the first time that the Bundestag had removed a German chancellor since the end of World War II. Even after his downfall, Mr. Schmidt was unapologetic about his perceived arrogance. In a 1986 speech on his retirement from the Bundestag, he noted that unemployment had continued to climb under Chancellor Kohl. Then, facing Mr. Kohl, he asserted that the real jobless rate would be a little higher if you hadn't manipulated the numbers a little downward. Nearing retirement, Mr. Schmidt spent much of his time in his native port city of Hamburg. He wrote a memoir and occasional articles in which he continued to defend his outspoken exchanges with American presidents and politicians. I have always regarded myself as a reliable friend of the United States, but never have I misunderstood an alliance to be a system of control and command, he said in a 1984 interview with the New York Times. It's rather a system of advice and consent, if I may borrow a phrase from your Constitution. Now, a family secret revealed that Helmut Heinrich Wedemeyer Schmidt was born December 23, 1918, in Barmbek, a working-class district of Hamburg. His father, Gustav, was a school teacher. His mother, Ludovica, was an artistically gifted homemaker. Behind his facade of bourgeois rectitude there was a family secret, one he revealed long afterward. I had a Jewish grandfather, he told the New York Times Magazine at the end of a long interview in 1984. By falsifying documents, he explained, he and his father had hid the truth from the Nazi authorities. With Hitler rising to power in 1933, Helmut Schmidt joined the Hitler Youth, and in 1937 he was drafted into the German army. After the war began in 1939, he became a first lieutenant in an aircraft artillery battery on the Russian front and was awarded the Iron Cross. He and Hannelore Glaser, who was known as Loki, L-O-K-I, married in 1942. They had known each other since they were school children. They had a daughter, Susan. After the war, he enrolled at the University of Hamburg, obtaining a degree in political economy in 1949, and his wife became a school teacher. While still a student, Mr. Schmidt joined the Social Democratic Party and took a job in Hamburg's municipal government in 1948. 5 years later, he was elected to the Bundestag in Bonn, the West German capital. Early on, he established himself as a conservative, pragmatic maverick in the left-leaning social democratic mainstream. He supported West German rearmament in the 1950s, for instance, while most party colleagues opposed it. Bored with the Bundestag, he returned to Hamburg in 1961 and became the city's interior ministry. Early the next year, while the mayor was away on vacation, Mr. Schmidt vaulted into national prominence by supervising the emergency response to a calamitous flood in which at least 300 people drowned, victims of heavy rains that had sent a swollen Elbe River pouring over its dikes. Even after the mayor hurried back to the city, Mr. Schmidt relegated him to the sidelines while remaining in charge on the ground. Mr. Schmidt returned to the Bundestag in 1965, becoming an expert on defense policy. He also drew closer to the views of the Social Democratic Party leader Willy Brandt, who wanted to normalize relations between East and West Germany. Now listen closely, friends, to what's coming up. While Mr. Brandt concentrated on improving diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, Mr. Schmidt embraced a strong and continued United States military presence in Europe. In 1974, at his insistence, West Germany agreed to underwrite the stationing of American troops in the country. By then, he had become finance minister. Appointed in 1972, he sought to make the left-wing Social Democrats understand that West Germany's open-armed system of social benefits could be financed only by a thriving capitalist economy. An alliance with Giscard d'Estaing was, as finance minister, that Mr. Schmidt and his French counterpart, Mr. Giscard d'Estaing, developed a friendship and political alliance that would determine the balance of power in Western Europe. A Franco-German connection established through and by Mr. Schmidt. They seemed a mismatched pair, the article from the New York Times says. Mr. Giscard d'Estaing was tall, aristocratic, and politically conservative. Mr. Schmidt was short, devoid of social pretensions, and a leader of a center-left party. But both had lightning intelligence, technical expertise, and a proclivity to believe that they were always right. Most important, they shared a vision of Western Europe under French-German leadership moving toward economic integration. Let me pause right there in this story, friends, and remind you again, one of the three elements that Mr. Herbert Armstrong said needed to occur and that we should be watching for to see a United States of Europe come together in the way that it would need to come together in order for it to become 10 leaders who give their power to a beast for a short time that resurrects the Holy Roman Empire. That first thing Mr. Armstrong said was an economic union. This story is saying that Mr. Schmidt, under him, he and the French president shared a vision of Western Europe under French-German leadership moving toward economic integration. There's your economic union. He was envisioning that. Mr. Schmidt's path to the other two things were economic union, political union, and a military union. Mr. Schmidt's path to the pinnacle of power was cleared in 1974 when Mr. Brandt resigned in a scandal in which a close advisor had been revealed to be an East German spy. A few days later, on May 16, 1974, Mr. Schmidt became the fifth Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. His first trip abroad was to Paris to meet with the new French president, Mr. Giscard d'Estaing. Now, this part of the story is extremely interesting. Unable to speak to each other in each other's language, they conversed in English. Mr. Schmidt couldn't speak French, Mr. d'Estaing couldn't speak German, but they could both speak English, so they spoke to one another in English. French-German unity had been a cornerstone of Western Europe economic and foreign policy since the end of World War II. The prevailing view was that West Germany offered economic strength while France provided a confident voice on foreign affairs, one that the West Germans, hesitant to speak out so soon after the Hitler era, eagerly welcomed. The more pragmatic, if not cynical, take on the relationship was that it allowed the French to keep close tabs on a historic rival and Germans to rid themselves of the Nazi stigma. The Schmidt-d'Estaing bond, Franco-German alliance, went beyond pragmatism, however. They spoke often by telephone and made unannounced visits to each other. At international conferences, they usually sat side by side, whispering to each other as they shaped common positions. Franco-German alliance. Their cooperation had notable results. They pushed for the establishment of the European Council, in which heads of government met regularly. They set the path for the political union to begin to form, and an economic union begin to form. And once that comes into place firmly, friends, we'll see a military union shape out of it. Germans already producing weapons they're selling to other countries, and they've already established a military presence. The stage is set for the military union part of the EU. The three union factors that the Apostle Herbert for the end days said, watch for as you see the United States of Europe come together and what it needs to be in order for the 10 nations the 10 leaders, the 10 nations to be able to give their power to a new end-time emperor who will head the revived Holy Roman Empire for its seventh and final time. The end of the story goes like this, friends. The two men, Schmidt and d'Estaing, backed the European monetary system, the economic union factor, which in 1999 finally led to the creation of a common currency, the euro, for members of the European Union. Mr. Schmidt had a big role in getting this end-time European Union thing coming together with its first element needed for forming what needs to be formed for the beast power to come out of Europe. That first element, as Apostle Herbert said, was an economic union, a single currency, which is off and running. It had its problems, as we've seen, as we've watched the news through the past years, but it's come together in the union, and the euro has strengthened, and it's gotten through many of those problems. Now the political union, as it shapes itself together, will be a fulfillment of the second element needed, and then we'll see a military union spring into position, surround Jerusalem, and then you'd better have your hat ready to go. For those of you who are looking forward to the promise Christ gave at the end of verse 36 in Luke 21, where he says, if you'll watch these events as they increase in intensity and frequency, and be praying about them, that second part needs to be done. Otherwise, you're just going to be like a Laodicean lukewarm. Well, I'm just watching those stuff, see what happens. Yeah, hey. No, you need to be praying about it from the bottom of your heart. As Christ says, praying always. And that word rendered always, means from the bottom of your heart, with all your mind and might and soul. Praying always, not just 5-10 minutes a day. Watching, thinking about these things we show you here in the news that are in the day's daily news, whether you watch it with us or on your own somehow. and thinking about it all day long and praying about it and the coming together of this European Union and being ready, having your conduct such as verses 34 and 35 say in Luke 21, Christ saying, take heed to yourselves that you don't be overcome with surfeiting, overeating and overindulgence in anything, and drunkenness, sleepiness. Wake up, as Mr. Herbert Armstrong said. Spiritually, wake up. Or with the cares of this world. Those are the three things Christ said in Luke 21, verse 34. Take heed to yourselves that you're not surfeiting, you're not into drunkenness, and you're not heavily into the cares of this world. And then he said, watch these events and pray always about them. Here's the carrot he held out, that you may be accounted worthy to escape what's coming next. And Christ explained in Luke 21 what's coming next with the explanation of the fifth seal, the great tribulation, followed by the heavenly sign, followed by the day of the Lord. And those are events you want to be in a safe place when all of that's happening, and Christ promises you can escape it. You can be in that safe place that he describes elsewhere in Revelation, things we cover on the weekend in greater detail. Friends, that is all the time we have for tonight. I've gone over time because of this special story about Helmut Schmidt that I wanted to give to you at the end. You can be praying, God help me watch these things that this man helped start with the first stage of what the European Union needed, according to the Apostle Herbert. It needed an economic union, a single currency that Mr. Schmidt helped start, the euro. It needed a political union, and he set the stage with that, with a common currency. Those who got into that eurozone with that were part of the EU that is still shaping its political union thing out. They're still arguing about the model for handling those countries that are not part of the Eurozone, but they're shaping it. And in the weeks and months ahead, we'll see that political union hammer down, and eventually you'll see it reshape into 10 leaders. And that could happen, kaboom, overnight. The Pope may play a big part in that, and he may designate who's who and who's the leaders and what the boundaries of those 10 regions are, 5 in the east, 5 in the west. We could see that happen whammo overnight. And then they've already got the stage set for a military union, so things are ready to go. Are you ready to go? Are you watching your conduct? Luke 21, verse 34, taking heed to yourself regarding surfeiting, overindulging in anything, especially too easily today to overindulge in the immorality of this world. That's a form of overeating, spiritually speaking. Are you keeping your eyes away from those things that excite the lust? That Christ said, don't even look after a woman to lust after her. That's a part of surfeiting. You can be overeating from this world and drinking in poison and sin to yourself that will keep you from what you need to be. It'll keep you from praying with all your heart about it. You won't, I don't want God's kingdom to come. I'm enjoying this world. And you're not spiritually awake. That's a certain form of drunkenness and the cares of this world, taking heed to not be overly involved with the cares of this world, but to want to see God's kingdom come and be praying about when you see the stories like from last night, 15 million people, last night or the night before, 15 million people suffering from famine, from scarcity of food, not having enough food to eat. Do you care about that? That's a prophecy that God says is going to happen in the United States if the United States fails to repent, and the UK. If we, as the sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, fail to repent, God says 1/3 of your people will die from the sword, another third, that's 2/3 now, another third will die from famine and pestilence, and the final third will be taken into captivity, many of whom will die in captivity, and only a few left to live over into the world tomorrow. Friends, I've got to sign off there. We've gone as long as I should go tonight. We've gone extra time. Thank you for joining me. That's it for this Tuesday night. God willing, and the creek don't rise, we'll be back again tomorrow night, Wednesday night, with the day's current news related to the Bible and prophecy as things shape toward a seventh restoration of the Holy Roman Empire, with the seventh head being brought in as a new emperor crowned by the Pope. It'll happen in Frankfurt, Germany, where it's always happened, in the Kaiser's Hall, the Emperor's Hall up on the second floor of the Romer building. Be sure you're watching every night. We are honing in on the news that relates to all this, and whether God delays it much longer and you have to keep watching days more, or he snaps this together overnight, it could happen. Boom, boom, boom. Be sure you're learning how to pray always, and be praying about these events you saw today. Friends, thanks for joining me. So long. Till God willing, we'll be back tomorrow night. I'm your host, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth, saying so long and good night, friends.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on COGTV.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the COGTV.org video archive.